No one in Manhattan believed that Daniel Royce, the youngest self-made millionaire CEO in the city's history, was incapable of love. Yet those closest to power whispered it like a fact rather than a rumor, because for a man who controlled markets, dominated boardrooms, and bent billion-dollar negotiations to his will, Daniel remained emotionally unreachable, distant in a way that felt deliberate, calculated, and permanent. And he preferred it that way, because love, in his world, was inefficiency, vulnerability, and risk. And risk was something he had learned to eliminate early in life, back when survival demanded discipline instead of emotion, ambition instead of affection, and silence instead of confession. And so by the time he stood at the top of Royce Industries' glass-walled office overlooking the New York skyline, Daniel believed his life was complete, structured perfectly around control and predictability, until the day a simple woman walked into his world carrying nothing but fabric, thread, and a quiet strength that unsettled everything he thought he understood about himself. Because Amelia Carter was not supposed to exist in his orbit, not in a city where status determined worth and wealth defined value, yet she did, moving through Manhattan with a kind of grounded resilience that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with purpose. And on the morning their lives collided, Daniel was preparing for a high-profile charity gala that demanded perfection, as everything in his life did. And when his assistant informed him that the tailor he had contracted months ago had fallen ill and sent to replacement, Daniel barely looked up, irritation already forming, because last-minute changes were unacceptable. But then Amelia entered his office, carrying a garment bag nearly as large as she was, her presence unassuming yet composed, her posture calm, her movements precise, and something in the air shifted subtly, though Daniel would not have named it then, because Amelia did not look like the women who usually crossed his path. She wore no designer labels, no forced confidence, no practiced charm, only a simple blouse, neatly pressed slacks, and hands that bore the quiet evidence of honest work. And when she spoke, her voice was steady, respectful, and direct, introducing herself as a seamstress sent to ensure the suit fit perfectly. And Daniel, accustomed to being flattered or feared, found himself momentarily disarmed by her lack of reaction to his status, because she neither lingered nor rushed, neither stared nor shrank. And as she began taking measurements with professional efficiency, Daniel noticed details he rarely paid attention to: the focus in her eyes, the calm rhythm of her breath, the way she treated her work not as service but as craft. And it irritated him, because it forced awareness where he preferred indifference. And as minutes passed in silence, punctuated only by the soft sound of fabric shifting, Daniel felt an unfamiliar tension settle in his chest. Not desire, not attraction, but curiosity, which was far more dangerous. And when he finally spoke, asking curtly how long she had been sewing, Amelia answered simply, explaining that she had learned from her grandmother that sewing paid the bills when college didn't work out, and that she enjoyed creating things that made people feel confident. And the sincerity in her words unsettled him more than ambition ever could, because there was no hunger for power behind her gaze, only quiet pride. And when she finished and stepped back, assessing her work with a critical eye, Daniel caught himself waiting for her approval, an absurd realization that irritated him further. And when she nodded, satisfied, thanked him for his time, and turned to leave without another word, something in Daniel resisted the end of that moment, though he could not explain why. And after she left, he found himself staring at his reflection, suit perfectly tailored, yet feeling strangely exposed, as if something had shifted beneath the surface of a life he believed was immovable. And he dismissed it as distraction, because distraction was weakness, and weakness had no place in his world. Yet over the following days, Amelia's presence lingered in his thoughts with surprising persistence, surfacing during meetings, during workouts, during late nights at the office, and it frustrated him, because he could not categorize her as conquest, employee, or threat, and that ambiguity challenged the structure he relied on. And when the gala arrived, Daniel moved through the event with practiced ease, shaking hands, delivering polished speeches, maintaining the image of control expected of him. Yet something was missing, and he realized it only when he saw Amelia standing near the edge of the ballroom, adjusting a gown on a nervous young woman, her focus entirely on her work, unaware of the power surrounding her. And in that moment, Daniel understood that her presence grounded the chaos, rather than feeding it. And that realization frightened him more than he cared to admit, because grounding required vulnerability, and vulnerability required surrender, and surrender had never been part of his plan. Yet as the night unfolded, Daniel found excuses to pass near her, to observe her interactions, to note the way people relaxed around her, and when she finally noticed him watching, her expression held no awe, only mild curiosity, and she offered a polite smile before returning to her work. And that dismissal, intentional yet absolute, ignited something in Daniel that had nothing to do with ego and everything to do with recognition, because for the first time, he was seen not as a billionaire, not as a CEO, but simply as a man wearing a suit that needed tailoring. And when the gala ended and guests departed, Daniel found himself seeking her out, asking her opinion on the event under the pretense of professionalism, and Amelia answered honestly, remarking on the excess, the pressure, and the strange loneliness of crowded rooms, and her words struck deeper than he expected, because they mirrored truths he had never allowed himself to voice. And as they spoke, briefly and without pretense, Daniel sensed the beginning of a fracture in the carefully constructed walls around his life, a fracture he should have repaired immediately, yet instead he allowed it to remain, because something about her presence suggested not chaos, but balance. And as she left that night, thanking him and wishing him well with genuine kindness, Daniel stood alone in the empty ballroom, realizing that for the first time in years, success felt insufficient. And though he did not yet understand it, a simple seamstress had just stepped into his life and quietly challenged everything he believed about love, control, and the cost of emotional isolation, marking the beginning of a transformation that no amount of wealth could prevent. Daniel Royce had built his life on routine, and the days following the gala were no exception. Yet something subtle had shifted beneath the surface of his perfectly calibrated schedule, because no matter how deeply he immersed himself in quarterly reports, acquisition strategies, or investor briefings, the image of Amelia Carter lingered in the quiet spaces between decisions, not intrusively, but persistently, like a question he could not dismiss, and it unsettled him more than he cared to acknowledge, because Daniel did not dwell on people, especially not people who existed outside his carefully curated world, and yet here he was, replaying a conversation that had lasted no more than a few minutes, analyzing the cadence of her voice, the clarity of her gaze, the unguarded honesty of her observations about loneliness and excess, and it irritated him that her words had landed so precisely, because they had exposed a truth he had buried beneath years of discipline and ambition. And as he stood in his office overlooking the Hudson River, glass walls reflecting a city that mirrored his own relentless drive, Daniel reminded himself that curiosity was temporary, and that his attention belonged to the empire he had built, not to a seamstress whose presence should have faded the moment she left the ballroom. Yet fate, indifferent to intention, had other plans, because later that afternoon, his assistant informed him that a shipment of custom garments for an upcoming international conference had been delayed due to production errors, and the recommended solution, inconvenient and inefficient, was to outsource final alterations locally. And despite himself, Daniel heard Amelia's name mentioned as a trusted independent professional, and though he hesitated, aware that proximity would only amplify the disruption she had already caused, he approved the arrangement under the guise of practicality, convincing himself that this was business, nothing more. And when Amelia arrived at his office 2 days later, carrying her tools with the same quiet confidence as before, Daniel noticed immediately that the environment responded to her presence differently, as if the sterile precision of his office softened in her wake, and she greeted him politely, professionally, without familiarity or pretense, which both relieved and disappointed him in equal measure. And as she worked, adjusting fabrics and examining seams, Daniel found himself observing her hands, skilled and deliberate, creating order from raw material, and he realized with faint surprise that her craft mirrored his own in unexpected ways, because where he shaped companies and markets, she shaped cloth and confidence, both requiring patience, precision, and vision. And when he commented on her attention to detail, Amelia smiled faintly and explained that clothing was not about appearance alone, but about how people carried themselves once they felt comfortable in their own skin. And her words resonated unexpectedly, because Daniel had long believed that confidence came from dominance, from control, from being untouchable. Yet here was someone suggesting that confidence could be nurtured gently, crafted quietly, and the idea unsettled him because it implied a softness he had never allowed himself. And when she finished and prepared to leave, Daniel surprised them both by asking her to stay for a coffee, framing it as gratitude for her flexibility. And Amelia hesitated, clearly weighing boundaries, before agreeing with cautious politeness. And as they sat in the understated lounge adjacent to his office, conversation unfolded slowly, awkwardly at first, then with growing ease, touching on her work, her upbringing in a small Midwestern town, her move to New York driven by necessity rather than ambition. And Daniel listened, genuinely, without the impatience he reserved for most interactions, because Amelia's life story was not defined by conquest or victory, but by endurance, adaptation, and quiet pride. And when she asked about his path to success, Daniel offered the polished version, the narrative he shared publicly, omitting the loneliness, the sacrifices, the emotional isolation. And Amelia listened without interruption, then observed gently that success seemed to have cost him more than he realized, and her insight struck deeper than criticism ever could, because it was not accusatory, only perceptive. And for the first time in years, Daniel felt seen without being evaluated. And when their coffee ended and Amelia stood to leave, Daniel felt an unfamiliar reluctance, an impulse to prolong the moment. Yet he restrained himself, because restraint was discipline, and discipline had built his world. And after she left, Daniel returned to his desk, unsettled by the realization that a single conversation had done more to disrupt his equilibrium than any hostile takeover or market crash. And over the following weeks, Amelia's presence became a quiet constant, returning periodically for fittings and adjustments, each interaction reinforcing a connection Daniel neither pursued nor resisted, existing instead in a space of cautious curiosity. And he noticed how his staff responded to her with ease, how conversations felt lighter in her presence, how even the office itself seemed less oppressive, and it forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth, that control had brought him power, but not fulfillment, and that perhaps the walls he had built were no longer protecting him, but isolating him. And one evening, after a particularly grueling day marked by aggressive negotiations and political maneuvering, Daniel found himself walking instead of driving, drawn inexorably towards the small neighborhood where Amelia worked, a modest storefront tucked between a bakery and a laundromat, its windows displaying carefully crafted garments rather than brand names. And he stood outside longer than he intended, observing her through the glass as she worked late, focused, unhurried, and content in a way he rarely felt. And when she noticed him and stepped outside, surprise flickering briefly across her face before settling into warmth, Daniel felt the distance between their worlds narrow, and they spoke casually about work, about the city, about nothing and everything. And as the evening unfolded, Daniel realized that being with Amelia required no performance, no strategy, no dominance, only presence. And that realization frightened him, because presence demanded vulnerability, and vulnerability threatened the identity he had constructed so carefully. Yet as he walked away that night, Daniel acknowledged for the first time that the question was no longer whether Amelia would affect his life, but whether he was willing to confront the parts of himself her presence had awakened, because the simple seamstress had begun to unravel more than fabric. She had begun to unravel the carefully stitched armor around his heart. And though Daniel did not yet understand where this path would lead, he sensed with growing certainty that there was no returning to the man he had been before she walked into his world.
Daniel Royce did not invite disruption into his life, yet by the third week since Amelia Carter had entered it, disruption had quietly become routine, not in dramatic gestures or impulsive decisions, but in subtle shifts that altered the rhythm of his days, because he now found himself anticipating her visits, adjusting meetings to avoid overlap, then inexplicably rearranging them again to ensure he would see her. And this contradiction irritated him, because Daniel prided himself on decisiveness, not hesitation. And yet Amelia's presence had introduced a space between impulse and action that felt unfamiliar and strangely necessary. And as autumn settled over New York, painting the city in muted golds and grays, Daniel noticed that he no longer viewed the skyline from his office as a symbol of conquest, but as a backdrop to a life that suddenly felt incomplete. And this realization unsettled him deeply, because incompleteness implied need, and need implied vulnerability, and vulnerability was the one currency he had never allowed himself to trade in. Yet the more time he spent with Amelia, the more he recognized that her strength came not from avoidance, but from acceptance, and that distinction challenged everything he believed about power. And one evening, after a long day of negotiations that left him mentally exhausted, Daniel found himself lingering near her workshop again, watching as she closed for the night, locking the door with practiced care. And when she noticed him waiting across the street, her surprise was genuine, but so was her smile, and she asked casually if something was wrong, and Daniel, unused to explaining himself without strategy, answered honestly that he had simply needed air. And Amelia nodded as if that explanation made perfect sense, inviting him to walk with her for a few blocks before heading home. And as they moved through the neighborhood, past dimly lit storefronts and quiet intersections, Daniel felt a sense of ease that contrasted sharply with the pressure-filled environments he inhabited daily. And conversation flowed naturally, touching on small observations, shared humor, and moments of silence that felt comfortable rather than awkward. And in those silences, Daniel became acutely aware of how rarely he allowed himself to exist without purpose, without agenda, without expectation. And Amelia's presence seemed to grant permission for that stillness. And when she spoke about her grandmother teaching her to sew, about the patience required to fix mistakes without frustration, Daniel listened with an attention he usually reserved for high-stakes deals, because her philosophy mirrored something he had forgotten, that progress did not always require force, and that care could be as powerful as ambition. And when they reached her apartment building, modest but well-kept, Amelia paused, clearly aware of the boundary between invitation and implication, and Daniel respected that boundary instinctively, surprising himself by not testing it, and instead he thanked her for the walk, expressing genuine appreciation rather than obligation. And Amelia smiled, telling him that sometimes the simplest moments carried the most weight. And as she disappeared inside, Daniel stood alone beneath the streetlight, realizing that her words applied not just to the evening, but to the slow unraveling of his emotional defenses. And over the next several days, Daniel noticed a shift in his own behavior. He listened more, interrupted less, questioned assumptions he had long accepted, and his staff noticed it too, remarking quietly on his calmer demeanor, his willingness to consider perspectives beyond profit and efficiency. And Daniel attributed these changes to maturity, to growth, to leadership evolution. Yet deep down, he knew the truth, that Amelia had introduced a different metric of success into his life, one that valued balance over dominance. And when an unexpected crisis erupted within the company, involving a public relations issue that threatened investor confidence, Daniel found himself seeking Amelia's perspective, not because she possessed corporate expertise, but because her clarity cut through complexity. And when he explained the situation over coffee, framing it as curiosity rather than dependence, Amelia listened thoughtfully, then offered an observation that reframed the issue entirely, suggesting transparency and accountability rather than control and suppression. And Daniel was struck by how instinctively she prioritized trust over image, and though the idea conflicted with his instincts, he implemented it. And when the strategy succeeded, stabilizing public perception and reinforcing long-term credibility, Daniel felt an unfamiliar sensation, not triumph, but gratitude, and he realized that Amelia's influence extended beyond his personal life, subtly reshaping his professional philosophy as well. And yet this growing connection was not without tension, because Daniel became increasingly aware of the gulf between their worlds, his defined by privilege and power, hers by effort and constraint. And he worried, quietly and privately, about the imbalance, about the ways his presence might disrupt her life rather than enhance it. And this concern was foreign to him, because he had never worried about the impact of his orbit on others. Yet Amelia's independence demanded respect rather than possession. And one night, during a late conversation in her workshop, as she finished an urgent order,
Daniel voiced this concern, acknowledging the difference in their circumstances, and Amelia responded with calm honesty, explaining that she did not fear imbalance, but she feared being diminished, and that as long as she was seen as an equal in worth, if not in wealth, the difference did not matter. And her words resonated deeply because they articulated a condition Daniel had never considered, that equality was not sameness, but mutual respect. And as weeks passed, their connection deepened in quiet, deliberate ways, shared meals, thoughtful conversations, moments of mutual support, and Daniel found himself reevaluating the narrative he had built around love, recognizing that his avoidance had not protected him from pain, but from growth. And this realization culminated one evening when Amelia invited him to a small community event showcasing local artisans, an environment far removed from his usual social circles. And though he hesitated, concerned about perception, he attended. And as he moved through the space, observing Amelia interact with friends and clients, witnessing the respect she commanded through kindness and skill rather than status, Daniel felt a profound shift in perspective, understanding that influence did not require authority and that fulfillment could be found in connection rather than control. And when he thanked her for inviting him, admitting that the experience had challenged his assumptions, Amelia smiled, telling him that sometimes the simplest moments carried the most weight. And as she disappeared inside, Daniel stood alone beneath the streetlight, realizing that her words applied not just to the evening, but to the slow unraveling of his emotional defenses. And as he stood at the threshold of his apartment that night, looking out at a city that felt different than it had before, Daniel acknowledged that the man who had never fallen in love was standing at the edge of something irreversible. And for the first time in his life, he did not retreat from that edge, but remained there, open, uncertain, and profoundly changed.
Daniel Royce had always believed that control was the highest form of security. Yet, as the weeks passed and his connection with Amelia Carter deepened, he began to realize that control without connection was merely isolation disguised as strength. And this realization unsettled him in ways he could neither quantify nor ignore. Because while his professional life continued to demand decisiveness and authority, his personal life was now shaped by reflection, patience, and a growing awareness of emotional presence. And as winter approached and the city transformed under colder skies, Daniel found himself caught between two worlds that no longer felt as separate as they once had. Because Amelia's influence followed him into boardrooms and negotiations, not as a distraction, but as a quiet recalibration of values. And this shift became impossible to ignore when Royce Industries faced a critical internal conflict that threatened to undermine both its reputation and its leadership. Because a senior executive, long trusted and deeply embedded in the company's expansion strategy, was implicated in unethical dealings that risked public exposure, and the board's immediate response was predictable: damage control, silence, legal maneuvering, and strategic denial. And Daniel listened, as he always had, absorbing perspectives, weighing consequences. Yet for the first time, his instinctive response was not alignment, but resistance, because Amelia's earlier words about trust, accountability, and long-term integrity echoed in his mind, and he recognized that suppressing the truth would preserve control at the cost of credibility. And as the boardroom debate intensified, Daniel made a decision that surprised even himself, insisting on a transparent internal investigation rather than a quiet settlement. And though resistance was immediate, his authority carried the motion forward. And as the meeting adjourned, Daniel felt the familiar adrenaline of leadership, but beneath it lay an unfamiliar vulnerability, because this decision was not driven by dominance, but by conscience, and that distinction mattered. And later that evening, seeking clarity rather than validation, Daniel visited Amelia's workshop unannounced, finding her focused on a complex alteration, fabrics spread across her work table. And when she noticed his tension, she did not press him, instead offering space and presence. And when Daniel finally spoke, explaining the situation without corporate language or strategic framing, Amelia listened attentively, then asked a single question that reframed everything, asking whether he wanted to lead from fear or from principle. And the simplicity of the question struck him harder than any opposition in the boardroom, because it revealed the core of the conflict.
and Daniel admitted that fear had shaped many of his past decisions: fear of loss, of vulnerability, of emotional exposure. And Amelia responded not with judgment, but with understanding, reminding him that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. And as they spoke, Daniel recognized that her guidance did not undermine his authority, but strengthened it, because it aligned his leadership with his evolving values. And in the days that followed, the investigation progressed, uncovering systemic issues that required accountability rather than concealment. And while the process invited scrutiny and criticism, it also reinforced trust among stakeholders who recognized the company's commitment to integrity. And Daniel faced backlash from some quarters, subtle challenges to his leadership, questions about his judgment, and moments of doubt that tested his resolve. Yet through it all, Amelia remained a steady presence, offering perspective rather than reassurance, reminding him that transformation was rarely comfortable and that growth often required dismantling old structures before building new ones. And as Daniel navigated these challenges, he became increasingly aware of how deeply Amelia had become woven into his life, not as an accessory or indulgence, but as a partner in thought and reflection. And this realization prompted a deeper internal reckoning, because partnership implied equality, and equality required vulnerability, and vulnerability demanded honesty. And one evening, after a particularly intense day marked by media scrutiny and internal resistance, Daniel invited Amelia to dinner at his apartment, not as a gesture of status, but as an invitation into his personal space. And Amelia accepted with measured curiosity, and when she arrived, Daniel noticed her subtle hesitation as she took in the expansive view, the minimalist decor, the quiet luxury that contrasted sharply with her own modest surroundings. And sensing her discomfort, Daniel acknowledged it openly, expressing his awareness of the imbalance and his desire for her to feel welcome rather than overwhelmed. And Amelia appreciated his honesty, explaining that she did not resent the difference, but she needed to know that she was valued for who she was, not as a novelty in his world. And Daniel affirmed that truth without hesitation, recognizing his respect for her was rooted not in contrast, but in admiration. And as they shared a simple meal, conversation flowed easily, touching on memories, aspirations, and the ways their lives had been shaped by choices made under constraint and opportunity. And Daniel spoke openly about his childhood, the early losses that had taught him to rely on discipline rather than affection. And Amelia shared stories of resilience, of learning to create stability through skill and perseverance. And in that exchange, Daniel felt a profound sense of alignment, because their experiences, though different in circumstance, were united by determination and self-reliance. And as the evening deepened, Daniel became aware of a growing emotional intimacy that extended beyond companionship. Yet he resisted labeling it, because labels carried expectations, and expectations carried risk. Instead, he allowed the moment to exist as it was, grounded and authentic. And when Amelia prepared to leave, Daniel felt the familiar pull to prolong the connection, yet he respected her boundaries, walking her to the door and thanking her for her presence rather than asking for more. And after she left, Daniel stood alone in his apartment, reflecting on how his life had expanded rather than contracted through vulnerability. And in the days that followed, the investigation reached its conclusion, resulting in decisive action that reinforced the company's ethical standards and reshaped its leadership culture. And while the process was costly in the short term, it positioned Royce Industries for sustainable growth built on trust rather than fear. And as Daniel addressed his employees, articulating a vision grounded in accountability and respect, he recognized that his words carried a sincerity they had lacked before, because they were no longer performative, but reflective of genuine conviction. And afterwards, as he stood alone in his office watching the city lights emerge against the darkening sky, Daniel acknowledged that the changes in his professional philosophy mirrored the transformation in his personal life, because Amelia had not only challenged his understanding of love, but his understanding of leadership, success, and fulfillment. And though he still hesitated to call what he felt love, he recognized that his emotional isolation had been a choice rather than a necessity, and that choice was now dissolving, replaced by a willingness to engage, to listen, and to share. And as he prepared to leave the office that night, Daniel sent Amelia a message thanking her for her insight and presence. And when her reply arrived,
simple and warm, expressing support without expectation, Daniel felt a quiet certainty settle in his chest, because he understood that the man who had never fallen in love was no longer standing apart from the world, but moving within it, guided not by control alone, but by connection. And though the path ahead remained uncertain, Daniel accepted that uncertainty with a calm he had never known, because for the first time, his life was not defined solely by what he could command, but by what he was willing to feel. And that realization marked a turning point from which there would be no retreat.
As spring unfolded across the city and the sharp edges of winter softened into longer days and gentler light, Daniel Royce found himself standing at a crossroads he had never anticipated, because despite his continued success and the renewed confidence of investors following the ethical restructuring of Royce Industries, there remained a quiet unrest within him that no strategic victory could resolve, and this unrest was tethered to Amelia Carter, whose presence had grown from a subtle influence into a defining force in his life. And yet the deeper his feelings became, the more acutely Daniel sensed the imbalance between their worlds, an imbalance that could not be ignored indefinitely, because while Amelia navigated life with humility and resilience, Daniel moved through spaces defined by power, privilege, and scrutiny, and the question of whether those worlds could coexist without consuming one another weighed heavily on him, particularly as public attention around Royce Industries intensified and his personal life became increasingly visible to those eager for leverage or narrative. And this tension surfaced one evening when Daniel attended a high-profile charity event accompanied not by a date, but by expectation, because rumors had already begun to circulate among social circles and media outlets, speculating about the reclusive CEO's rumored relationship with a woman whose background defied the usual archetypes, and Daniel was aware that bringing Amelia into such a setting would expose her to judgment, comparison, and intrusion, yet excluding her would feel like a denial of her importance. And when he raised the subject cautiously during a quiet dinner at her workshop, Amelia listened thoughtfully before responding with characteristic clarity, stating that she did not fear judgment, but she refused to be hidden. And her words struck Daniel with their simplicity and strength, because they revealed a boundary he had not consciously considered, and he realized that protecting someone did not mean deciding for them, but trusting their agency. And so when the evening of the gala arrived, Daniel and Amelia entered together, not as a spectacle, but as equals, and the reaction was immediate and palpable, because Amelia's understated elegance, her confidence unshaped by approval, unsettled the rigid hierarchies of the room, and Daniel observed with quiet pride how she navigated conversations without pretense, engaging sincerely with those who approached her, neither apologizing for her background nor attempting to transcend it. And as the evening progressed, Daniel became acutely aware of the duality of his emotions, pride intertwined with protectiveness, admiration with vulnerability. And this emotional complexity reached a turning point when an influential investor made a condescending remark about Amelia's profession, framing it as an amusing anomaly rather than a legitimate craft. And before Daniel could intervene, Amelia responded calmly, articulating the value of skilled labor, the dignity of creation, and the overlooked artistry that sustained industries far beyond the glamour of executive offices. And her response silenced the table, not through confrontation, but through conviction. And Daniel felt a profound shift within himself, because in that moment, he recognized that Amelia did not need him to defend her, she needed him to stand beside her, and that realization reframed his understanding of partnership. And later that night, as they left the gala and stepped into the quiet of the city streets, Daniel thanked Amelia for her grace and honesty, and Amelia, sensing the weight behind his words, asked him directly whether he was prepared for the consequences of being seen with her openly, because visibility invited scrutiny, and scrutiny demanded resilience, and Daniel answered without hesitation, acknowledging that while he could not control public perception, he could control his commitment. And this admission marked a pivotal moment, because it transformed his feelings from private contemplation into conscious choice. And in the weeks that followed, Daniel began to integrate Amelia into his life more fully, not as an accessory, but as a presence with influence and voice, inviting her to company events, consulting her perspective on workplace culture, and observing how her insights, grounded in empathy and practicality, resonated with employees across levels. And this integration did not go unnoticed, because while some admired the change in Daniel's leadership,
leadership, others perceived it as vulnerability, and among those skeptics was a rival executive who saw Amelia not as a partner, but as a liability. And this perception culminated in a subtle but calculated attempt to undermine Daniel's authority by questioning his judgment and priorities. And when the challenge reached Daniel through back-channel conversations and veiled criticisms, he felt the familiar pull toward isolation, the instinct to retreat and compartmentalize. Yet this time, instead of withdrawing, he chose transparency, addressing the concerns directly in a leadership meeting, affirming that his values had evolved, not weakened, and that empathy and integrity were not distractions from success, but foundations for sustainable growth. And his convictions shifted the tone of the discussion, reinforcing his authority while redefining its basis. And that evening, as Daniel and Amelia walked through a quiet park near her neighborhood, Daniel shared his fears openly, admitting that loving someone outside his world exposed him to risks he had spent a lifetime avoiding. And Amelia responded not by minimizing those risks, but by reminding him that avoidance had not protected him from loneliness, and that connection, while uncertain, offered meaning that control never could. And her words resonated deeply because they articulated the truth Daniel had been circling for months. And as their relationship deepened, Daniel found himself confronting aspects of his identity long neglected, including the parts shaped by loss, fear, and self-imposed solitude. And one night during a rare moment of stillness, Daniel admitted to Amelia that he had never said the words, "I love you," to anyone, not out of cruelty, but out of fear that love would weaken his resolve. And Amelia listened without pressure, acknowledging his honesty while expressing her own belief that love did not diminish strength, but transformed it. And this exchange did not culminate in declarations or promises, but in mutual understanding. And in that restraint lay profound intimacy, because both recognized that what they were building required patience rather than urgency. And as the season progressed, Daniel noticed subtle changes within himself, moments of warmth where there had been detachment, moments of reflection where there had been reaction, and he understood that Amelia's presence had not altered his ambition, but had given it context, grounding success in purpose rather than accumulation. And as he stood one evening at the window of his office, watching the city illuminated against the night sky, Daniel acknowledged that the man who had never fallen in love was now standing at the threshold of something transformative, something that could not be quantified or controlled. And for the first time, he did not retreat from that uncertainty, but stepped toward it, accepting that love, like leadership, required courage, trust, and the willingness to be seen. And though the future remained unwritten, Daniel felt a growing certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them not from opposite sides of the divide, but together, bound not by status or expectation, but by shared values and deliberate choice.
By the time summer settled fully over the city, Daniel Royce understood that love, once awakened, did not arrive gently, but insisted on reordering everything it touched. And this understanding followed him into every corner of his life, from the glass-walled offices of Royce Industries to the quiet moments he now shared with Amelia Carter. Moments that had become both refuge and revelation, because with Amelia, he did not need to perform strength. He only needed to be present, and that presence continued to reshape him in ways he had never anticipated. Yet growth rarely moved without resistance, and the deeper their bond became, the more visible it grew to those who thrived on power dynamics, leverage, and imbalance. And among them was Victor Hale, a senior partner whose alliance had once been instrumental in Daniel's rise, but whose loyalty was always transactional. And Victor saw in Amelia not a woman of substance, but an opening, a vulnerability Daniel had created by allowing his private life to intersect with his professional authority. And the first sign of conflict arrived subtly, through whispers rather than confrontation, when Daniel began to sense a shift in boardroom dynamics, pauses that lingered too long, glances exchanged at moments of emphasis, questions framed as concern rather than accusation. And though none of it was overt, Daniel recognized the pattern immediately because he had used it himself in earlier years. and this realization unsettled him more than the challenge itself, because it forced him to confront the reflection of his former self. And instead of responding with defensiveness, Daniel chose observation, tracking the source of dissent until it crystallized into a proposal Victor presented under the guise of strategic expansion, a merger that promised financial gain but required ethical compromises Daniel was no longer willing to accept. And when Daniel expressed reservations, Victor countered with insinuations, suggesting that personal distractions had clouded his judgment. And though the room remained silent, the implication was clear, and Daniel felt the weight of the moment press against him, because this was not merely a business disagreement, it was a test of authority, values, and resolve. And Daniel responded with calm clarity, articulating his refusal not as moral superiority, but as long-term vision, emphasizing sustainability, trust, and accountability. And while his reasoning was sound, he knew the challenge was far from over, because Victor was not accustomed to denial. And later that evening, when Daniel shared the situation with Amelia, she listened with focused attention, recognizing the underlying threat beneath the corporate language. And when Daniel expressed concern that she might become collateral in a conflict she never sought, Amelia responded with quiet firmness, reminding him that her presence was not a weakness unless he allowed others to define it as such. And her confidence grounded him, yet it also forced him to examine his own fears, because beneath his protectiveness lay the unresolved belief that love required sacrifice, and sacrifice meant loss. And as the days unfolded, Victor's tactics escalated, leaking selective narratives to media outlets, framing Daniel's leadership shift as instability rather than evolution. And though Amelia was never named directly, the implication of an unnamed influence was unmistakable, and Daniel faced mounting pressure as headlines questioned his focus, his priorities, and his future. And for the first time since he had allowed himself to care, Daniel felt the instinct to retreat, to shield Amelia by creating distance. And this internal conflict reached its breaking point when a reporter approached Amelia outside her workshop, asking pointed questions that crossed the line from curiosity into intrusion. And though Amelia handled the encounter with composure, Daniel saw the aftermath in her eyes, the exhaustion of being scrutinized for simply existing alongside him. And that night, as they sat together in the quiet of her apartment, Daniel admitted his fear openly, confessing that he did not know how to protect her without retreating into control. And Amelia responded with empathy rather than frustration, acknowledging the difficulty while asserting that protection without partnership was another form of isolation. And her words cut through his uncertainty, because they revealed that his impulse to withdraw, though rooted in care, would ultimately undermine the very connection he sought to preserve. And in that moment, Daniel made a decision that would redefine not only his leadership, but his relationship, choosing transparency over containment. And the following morning, Daniel addressed the media directly, not to defend his personal life, but to reaffirm his values, stating clearly that his leadership was informed by integrity, empathy, and accountability, and that those qualities strengthened rather than weakened his vision. And while he did not mention Amelia by name, his refusal to separate his humanity from his authority sent a powerful message. And the response was immediate and polarized, some applauding the shift, others criticizing it. But Daniel felt an unfamiliar sense of alignment, because for the first time his public stance reflected his private truth. And as the fallout continued, Victor confronted Daniel privately, accusing him of jeopardizing alliances and risking instability. And Daniel responded without anger, acknowledging the cost while standing firm in his decision. And in that exchange, Daniel recognized that power rooted in fear could not coexist with leadership rooted in principle. And Victor, sensing the shift, withdrew his support, leaving behind uncertainty but also clarity. And as Daniel navigated the consequences, Amelia remained present, not as a shield but as a source of perspective, reminding him that loss was sometimes the necessary price of growth. And as summer deepened, Daniel noticed how his internal landscape had transformed, how decisions once driven by dominance were now guided by alignment, and how vulnerability, once perceived as a threat, had become a source of strength. And one evening, after weeks of tension, Daniel and Amelia escaped the city for a brief retreat, seeking distance from scrutiny and noise. And in the quiet of a coastal town, walking along the shoreline under a sky streaked with fading light, Daniel felt the weight he had carried begin to ease. And there, without audience or agenda, he spoke the truth he had been circling for months, telling Amelia that she had changed him not by demanding more, but by reminding him who he was beneath the armor. And Amelia listened, eyes steady, heart open, and responded by sharing her own fears, admitting that loving someone so visible carried its own risks, yet she chose him not for his power, but for his willingness to grow. And in that exchange, something settled between them, not a dramatic declaration, but a shared understanding that love was not an escape from challenge, but a commitment to face it together. And as they stood watching the tide roll endlessly toward shore, Daniel realized that the man who had never fallen in love was gone, replaced by someone willing to stand in uncertainty without retreat. And though the path ahead promised continued resistance, scrutiny, and sacrifice, Daniel accepted it without hesitation, because for the first time, his life was no longer divided between success and connection, but unified by purpose. And as he held Amelia's hand, feeling the quiet certainty of her presence, Daniel understood that love had not weakened him, it had anchored him, and that anchor would carry him through whatever storms lay ahead. Autumn arrived quietly, draping the city in cooler air and deeper colors. And with it came a new phase in Daniel Royce's life, one marked not by crisis, but by consequence. Because while the storm ignited by Victor Hale's withdrawal had begun to settle, the landscape it left behind demanded reconstruction, and Daniel approached this challenge with a clarity he had never known before, guided not by fear of loss, but by commitment to alignment. And as Royce Industries adjusted to the departure of several long-standing partners unwilling to embrace the company's ethical direction, Daniel felt both the weight and the liberation of change. Because though the financial implications were significant, the internal culture began to shift in ways that affirmed his choice. And through it all, Amelia Carter remains a constant presence, not as a strategist or advisor, but as a grounding force who reminded Daniel that rebuilding was not only about numbers and narratives, but about trust, patience, and human connection. And yet, despite their growing closeness, an unspoken tension lingered beneath the surface. Because while Daniel had learned to integrate love into his identity, Amelia still navigated the uncertainty of what it meant to belong in a world that could turn harsh without warning. And this tension surfaced one evening when Amelia received an offer she had not expected, an opportunity to expand her work by collaborating with a small but respected design collective that required her to relocate temporarily to another city. And though the offer represented growth and recognition, it also introduced distance. And when she shared the news with Daniel, he listened carefully, aware that his response would reveal more than words ever could. And while a part of him felt the instinctive pull to resist, to frame the separation as impractical or poorly timed, he chose honesty instead, admitting that the prospect of distance frightened him, not because he doubted their connection, but because he feared reverting to old patterns of emotional withdrawal. and Amelia appreciated his vulnerability, explaining that the opportunity mattered to her not only professionally but personally, because it symbolized independence rather than escape. And in that exchange, both recognized that love did not eliminate individual paths, but required space for them to coexist. And as days passed and Amelia prepared for her departure, Daniel found himself confronting the limits of control once again, realizing that commitment did not grant ownership, and that supporting someone meant honoring their growth even when it introduced uncertainty. And on her final night before leaving, they walked together through the city streets, the familiar rhythms of their shared world now tinged with anticipation and restraint. And Daniel resisted the urge to fill the silence with reassurance or promises, instead choosing presence. And when they stopped beneath the canopy of autumn leaves, Amelia turned to him and spoke with quiet clarity, expressing her belief that what they shared was not fragile, but unfinished, and that distance would test their connection not to break it, but to reveal its strength. And Daniel responded not with fear, but with resolve, affirming that he would remain present not through surveillance or control, but through trust. And when Amelia left the next morning, Daniel watched her disappear into the crowd with a mixture of ache and pride, because he understood that loving her meant allowing her to step forward on her own terms. And in the weeks that followed, Daniel poured himself into reshaping Royce Industries, navigating negotiations with emerging partners aligned with his vision, mentoring younger leaders who responded to authenticity rather than intimidation, and noticing how his leadership now invited collaboration rather than compliance. And though the absence of Amelia was felt keenly, it did not diminish his clarity, because their conversations continued through messages and calls grounded not in dependency but in shared reflection. And Daniel realized that for the first time, he was not using work to escape emotion, but using purpose to honor it. And as autumn deepened, Daniel faced another defining moment when an opportunity arose to take the company public under conditions that promised immense growth, but required compromises in governance. And instead of deciding in isolation, Daniel sought perspective from those he trusted, including Amelia, whose insight reminded him that expansion without alignment replicated the very patterns he had worked to dismantle. And Daniel declined the offer, choosing steady integrity over accelerated acclaim. And this decision further solidified his transformation because it demonstrated consistency between belief and action. And when Amelia returned weeks later, their reunion was not marked by dramatic declarations, but by ease, familiarity, and a sense of continuity that reassured them both. And as they settled back into their rhythm, Daniel recognized that love had not become a distraction from his life, but its framework, shaping decisions, values, and priorities with quiet strength. And one evening, as they sat together in Amelia's workshop, the hum of the city softened by distance and dusk, Daniel acknowledged aloud what had become undeniable, telling Amelia that loving her had not only changed how he felt, but how he lived. And Amelia responded by reminding him that change was mutual, that his willingness to grow had given her confidence in a future that did not demand compromise of self. And in that shared understanding, they recognized that love was not defined by permanence alone, but by choice renewed daily. And as the season edged closer to winter, Daniel felt a quiet certainty take root, because though challenges would continue, they would be met not from isolation or fear, but from connection, trust, and the shared courage to remain open. And the man who had never fallen in love now understood that love was not a single moment or declaration, but a series of deliberate acts, each one reinforcing the decision to remain present, honest, and whole.
As winter approached once again, blanketing the city in muted grays and icy light, Daniel Royce felt the weight of the year pressing upon him in ways that were both familiar and new, because while professional victories had been earned and personal connections deepened, the complexity of love, partnership, and vulnerability had introduced an unpredictability he had never managed before. And this unpredictability revealed itself most acutely in the subtle tensions that accompanied Amelia Carter's growing presence in his life.
For though their bond had strengthened through shared experience, trust, and understanding, there were moments when external pressures threatened to intrude, testing the balance they had cultivated. And the first sign came in the form of a high-stakes negotiation with an international investor whose demeanor was both persuasive and intimidating, because he questioned not only Daniel's strategic vision, but subtly alluded to distractions in his personal life, insinuating that the CEO's emotional entanglements could compromise corporate decision-making. And though Daniel had previously mastered the art of responding to veiled attacks with cool calculation, the knowledge that Amelia's existence in his orbit could be weaponized unsettled him more than he expected. And later that evening, he walked through the quiet streets near her workshop, reflecting on the magnitude of what they were building together. And the city, glittering yet still in shadow, felt both expansive and constrictive, because opportunity and risk often walked side by side. And Daniel realized that he could no longer compartmentalize his professional and personal life without incurring the cost of authenticity. And when he arrived at Amelia's apartment, he found her working late on a commission that required meticulous attention to detail. And as he observed her, he noticed the calm intensity with which she approached her craft, and the patience in her hands reminded him of lessons he had been slowly internalizing about restraint, trust, and timing. And in that quiet moment, Daniel spoke candidly about the negotiation and the underlying concerns, confessing not fear, but the burden of responsibility. And Amelia listened without interruption, offering insight framed not by wealth or power, but by perspective, caution, and principle. And when she suggested that he assert boundaries without sacrificing integrity, Daniel realized that her counsel was as indispensable as any boardroom strategy, because it reminded him that leadership, like love, required balance, clarity, and moral courage. And in the days that followed, Daniel implemented her advice with measured precision, confronting the investor directly, articulating not only the value of the company, but also the ethical framework he would not compromise. And the resolution was tense yet definitive, establishing a precedent that reinforced both authority and principle. And while the victory was professional, Daniel experienced a personal triumph as well, because he realized that he could embrace love without fear of compromise. And Amelia's influence had helped him see that strength was not diminished by vulnerability, but strengthened through authenticity. And yet the challenges of intimacy remained, because the increasing visibility of their relationship drew attention from media, colleagues, and opportunists alike. And Daniel understood that maintaining equilibrium required constant awareness, deliberate choice, and mutual respect. And one evening, after a particularly taxing day, marked by scrutiny and subtle undermining from competitors who sought to exploit perceived weakness, Daniel invited Amelia to a secluded rooftop overlooking the city, where the skyline stretched endlessly against the twilight. And there, under the muted glow of streetlights and the shimmer of distant windows, Daniel shared his anxieties, articulating the tension between exposure and privacy, desire and caution. And Amelia responded with quiet assurance, reminding him that transparency within their partnership mattered more than the perceptions of outsiders, and that together they could navigate challenges that alone would have been insurmountable. And in that exchange, Daniel felt the familiar walls he had maintained for years begin to shift, because for the first time, he acknowledged that love required surrender, not of identity, but of control over outcomes. And as they leaned against the railing, hands brushing naturally, he understood that the future would inevitably contain trials, yet he no longer feared them, because they would face those trials together, grounded in trust, shared vision, and the deliberate commitment to presence. And as the night deepened and the city lights flickered like stars against concrete, Daniel reflected on the journey that had brought him here, from a life defined by detachment and ambition to one infused with connection, choice, and emotional authenticity. And he recognized that Amelia had not merely entered his life as a passive companion, but had reshaped the parameters of his existence, forcing him to consider what mattered beyond power, wealth, and status. And in that reflection, he felt gratitude, awe, and an unfamiliar serenity, because for the first time, he understood that love was not a weakness to be guarded against, but a lens through which life gained meaning.
And this realization strengthened his resolve in both his professional and personal spheres, guiding decisions, reinforcing values, and infusing interactions with intentionality. And as the season progressed, Daniel and Amelia faced new challenges together, navigating public appearances, collaborative projects, and moments of distance without losing the intimacy that had been carefully cultivated. And each obstacle reinforced the notion that love required negotiation, compromise, and the willingness to remain open even when fear tempted retreat. And in quiet moments, whether walking along snow-dusted sidewalks, sharing late-night dinners, or observing the city from high-rise windows, Daniel reflected on the evolution within himself, recognizing that his former self, isolated and invulnerable, had given way to someone willing to trust, to risk, and to embrace uncertainty. And Amelia, in turn, saw in him not only a partner, but a man who could love without domination, who could protect without control, and who could build a shared life while respecting difference. And that understanding, mutual, deliberate, and profound, became the foundation of their relationship, guiding them through the subtle but persistent tests that emerged from a world defined by scrutiny, expectation, and ambition. And as winter deepened around them, Daniel realized that love was not an interruption to be managed, nor a complication to be endured, but an essential element of life, one that gave clarity to decisions, strength to resolve, and beauty to existence. And standing beside Amelia on that rooftop, feeling the cool wind and the warmth of her hand, Daniel understood that the man who had never fallen in love had finally arrived at the threshold of the life he was meant to lead, one defined not by control alone, but by connection, courage, and the quiet, unshakable knowledge that together they could face whatever the world might throw at them.
The city had grown colder, the nights longer, yet in the heart of Daniel Royce's life, warmth pulsed steadily, born not of comfort or routine, but of connection, because over the months, his bond with Amelia Carter had evolved into something neither expected nor forced, something built on trust, patience, and the subtle, persistent recognition of each other's humanity. And yet, as their closeness deepened, external pressures began to mount with a new intensity, because power and visibility had a way of attracting scrutiny, envy, and opportunism. And while Daniel had grown accustomed to handling corporate crises with precision, the intrusion of public attention into his personal life presented challenges that were entirely unfamiliar. And the first major test arrived when a prominent journalist, privy to selective information, published a story insinuating impropriety in the intersection of his professional decisions in his relationship with Amelia. And while the article contained no explicit falsities, its tone implied that his emotional attachment compromised judgment. And though Daniel initially felt anger flare, he quickly reminded himself that reaction without strategy would only validate the narrative, and instead he chose measured transparency, releasing a statement that framed his leadership in terms of integrity, ethics, and the conscious integration of personal values. And while the statement addressed the issue publicly, Daniel also sought Amelia privately, wanting her perspective, reassurance, and understanding. And when they met in the quiet of her workshop, Amelia expressed frustration not with him, but with the assumptions that often accompanied power. And together, they discussed ways to navigate visibility without compromise, balancing openness with protection. And in that conversation, Daniel recognized how much he had learned from her, because she viewed challenges not as threats, but as opportunities to assert clarity, resilience, and authenticity. And as they spoke, he noticed the subtle ways in which she mirrored the confidence and calm he had cultivated over years of corporate life, yet applied it with gentleness rather than force. And that reflection sparked a quiet admiration, because he understood that true strength could coexist with humility, empathy, and emotional awareness. And in the following days, Daniel applied these lessons, guiding communications, mentoring executives, and managing investor relations with a precision that blended strategy with principle. And in parallel, he navigated the increasing demands of their relationship, negotiating boundaries, expectations, and shared time in ways that honored both their autonomy and their connection. And while the scrutiny from outsiders continued, the internal foundation of trust between them grew stronger, providing a shield that allowed intimacy to flourish. And one evening, after weeks of particularly intense public attention and internal pressure, Daniel invited Amelia to join him on a weekend retreat to a secluded lakeside cabin, a space removed from the noise, the headlines, and the ceaseless demands of both their worlds. And as they arrived, the quiet of the surrounding forest, the gentle lapping of water, and the absence of external expectations created an atmosphere in which vulnerability could be expressed without fear. And Daniel, feeling the cumulative weight of the past months, finally spoke in a way he had not dared before, acknowledging the depth of his feelings, the transformation she had catalyzed, and the fear that he had carried for so long. And Amelia, listening intently, reciprocated with equal honesty, revealing her own apprehensions, hopes, and acknowledgement that love required not only courage, but the willingness to embrace uncertainty. And in that dialogue, neither needed to defend, persuade, or perform, because the trust between them allowed raw truth to exist without consequence, beyond understanding. And as night fell, they walked along the lakeshore, the moon reflecting silver on the water, hands brushing lightly, a tangible connection that spoke louder than words. And Daniel felt the familiar protective instinct intertwine with something deeper, the desire not to control, but to honor, support, and cherish. And Amelia responded by leaning into that presence, offering warmth, reassurance, and mutual commitment. And in that shared space, the culmination of months of growth, challenge, and emotional reckoning became evident, because both understood that love was no longer theoretical, abstract, or conditional, but practical, lived, and deliberate. And as the weekend progressed, moments of quiet reflection, laughter, and shared tasks further cemented the depth of their bond, from cooking meals together to navigating small conflicts with patience and empathy. And Daniel realized that this love, grounded in respect and mutual growth, had reshaped not only his understanding of connection, but his perception of himself, because he had learned that vulnerability was not a weakness, but a conduit for strength, and that partnership required openness rather than dominance. And as they returned to the city, the challenges awaiting them were still present, the scrutiny, the expectations, the relentless pace, yet they now approached these obstacles with a unified front, each decision informed not only by ambition, but by shared values, emotional clarity, and trust. And during one particularly stressful corporate review meeting, Daniel felt the internal tension rise as board members questioned projections, strategies, and decisions. Yet instead of retreating into rigid authority, he channeled the patience, empathy, and clarity cultivated through his relationship with Amelia, addressing concerns with transparency, acknowledging risks, while reaffirming commitments, and demonstrating a leadership style that merged decisiveness with humanity. And after the meeting concluded successfully, Daniel shared the outcome with Amelia over dinner, celebrating the accomplishment while recognizing the interplay between personal growth and professional effectiveness. And as they talked, he noticed the same qualities that had made her remarkable in private life also enhanced his capacity to lead, and that recognition deepened his admiration, because he understood that true partnership involved both challenge and support, reflection and action. And as the season edged closer to the year's end, Daniel contemplated the journey from a man defined by isolation, control, and ambition to someone willing to embrace love, risk, and vulnerability. And he realized that every challenge, every test, and every moment of tension had prepared him to recognize not only Amelia's value, but his own capacity for emotional depth, courage, and reciprocity. And one evening, standing with Amelia on a quiet balcony, overlooking the city lights shimmering in the winter night, Daniel felt the culmination of this journey, the recognition that the man who had never fallen in love had finally arrived at a place where love was not a complication, distraction, or vulnerability, but the foundation for a life rich in meaning, connection, and choice. And as they held each other close, silent and unspoken, Daniel knew that the coming year would inevitably bring more trials, more scrutiny, and more opportunities for growth. Yet he was no longer afraid, because he had learned that love, when nurtured through trust, honesty, and mutual respect, could withstand the weight of the world, and that in Amelia's presence he had discovered not only the courage to love, but the courage to be fully himself. And together they would
would face whatever challenges awaited them, anchored not in power, wealth, or position, but in the profound understanding that their hearts had found a home in each other, and that the trials outside would never diminish what they had built within. And with the city sprawling below and the night sky stretching infinitely above, Daniel finally allowed himself to feel complete, not because life was perfect, but because he had found a love that was real, enduring, and transformative. And he knew that nothing could undo what they had built, because it had been forged through challenge, reflection, growth, and unwavering presence.
Winter had fully embraced the city, coating streets with frost and casting long shadows across the skyline. Yet inside Daniel Royce's life, there was warmth, not of convenience, but of culmination, because the trials, challenges, and quiet reckonings of the past year had led him to a profound clarity about love, partnership, and the courage required to fully embrace both. And as Amelia Carter returned from her extended work project, the anticipation that had simmered for months reached its quiet crescendo. For in her absence, Daniel had confronted the depth of his emotions, the breadth of his vulnerabilities, and the reality that a life without her presence was incomplete in ways power, wealth, or achievement could never remedy. And when they finally reunited, the meeting was neither dramatic nor ostentatious, but a private, unguarded moment in her modest apartment, where the familiar scent of fabric and thread mingled with the quiet hum of evening. And as their eyes met, a tangible understanding passed between them, a mutual acknowledgement of longing, patience, and resilience that had been tested but never broken. And Daniel, feeling the weight of months without her close presence, spoke first, admitting the emptiness he had endured, the fear he had carried, and the awakening that her absence had triggered. And Amelia, listening with gentle intensity, revealed her own journey, the challenges faced in balancing independence with connection, the realization that her love for him was not diminished by distance, but strengthened by trust. And as their hands intertwined, the hesitations of the past melted into mutual clarity, because they had both learned that love required honesty, patience, and a willingness to meet each other, not with expectation, but with presence. And the conversation flowed late into the night, weaving through memories of shared moments, the quiet lessons of missteps, the small triumphs that had built the foundation of their bond. And as the hours passed, the world outside ceased to matter. The city, the scrutiny, the pressures, all reduced to distant background noise beneath the immediacy of their reconciliation. And Daniel, emboldened by the culmination of months of growth, finally voiced the words he had long withheld, declaring that he loved her wholly and without reservation. And Amelia, eyes glistening yet steady, responded with her own confession that she had always loved him, even in distance and challenge. And in that mutual revelation, a new equilibrium was forged, not one free of difficulty, but one founded on trust, commitment, and shared purpose. And in the days that followed, they navigated life together with renewed confidence, blending professional demands and personal connection in ways that respected their individuality while honoring the unity they had chosen. And at the company, Daniel's leadership reflected this integration as he approached negotiations, board meetings, and mentorship with a grounded authenticity informed by love and partnership rather than mere strategy. And colleagues noted the transformation, observing that his presence carried warmth without compromise, decisiveness without rigidity, and authority balanced with empathy. And Amelia's influence, though subtle, continued to ripple through decisions, communications, and culture, because her insight encouraged reflection, prioritization of ethical standards, and acknowledgement of human complexity. And outside the office, Daniel and Amelia embraced moments of quiet intimacy, walks through the city streets lit by winter lights, early morning coffee shared on balcony overlooks, evenings in the warmth of her workshop as they discussed art, life, and shared aspirations. And these routines, simple yet profound, reinforced the understanding that love was not only passion, but deliberate attention, not only desire, but care, not only presence, but willingness to face the world together. And as the season drew toward its close, the city around them seemed to mirror the internal resolution they had reached, a combination of stark clarity and gentle warmth.
and Daniel, standing beside Amelia one evening on a quiet rooftop, looked out over the skyline that had once represented conquest and control, now reimagined as a backdrop to connection, possibility, and shared life. And he realized that every obstacle they had faced, the scrutiny, the distance, the corporate challenges, the personal insecurities, had served to prepare them for this precise moment, the moment in which love was not tentative, but deliberate, not precarious, but grounded. And as Amelia rested her head on his shoulder, the chill of the air countered by the warmth of proximity, Daniel understood that reconciliation was not a single act, but a continuum of choice, honesty, and courage, and he embraced the fullness of that understanding because it allowed him to step into the future without fear, knowing that whatever trials awaited, they would confront them together, anchored not in power, status, or fear, but in the steadfast reality of their love. And as night fell over the city, blanketing the streets in quiet silver light, Daniel and Amelia shared a kiss that was both culmination and promise, sealing the journey of the man who had never fallen in love, and this simple seamstress who had entered his life not to change him by force, but to awaken the heart he had long kept protected. And in that embrace, all uncertainties dissolved, leaving only certainty, presence, and the knowledge that they had found in each other the partnership, trust, and enduring love that would carry them forward. And as winter's chill gave way to the subtle promise of spring, Daniel and Amelia stood together, ready to embrace the life they had consciously chosen, a life defined by love, resilience, trust, and the enduring power of connection.